But I want to talk about domestic terror because they are really going hard on this. And this is a topic that I brought up before. We've talked about this before. We've talked about the domestic terror bills. We've talked about the Patriot Act 2.0. We've talked about how Kamala Harris said that anyone who is considered to be a white supremacist should have their guns taken away with red flag laws, and how Joe Biden has bragged that he was one of the first authors of the original Patriot Act, and this new Patriot Act is coming down. But I really want to talk about this because they're going harder than ever before with this whole domestic terror thing. And there was this article that came up from the Daily Beast, and it says, quote, "Can U.S. spy agencies stop white terror?" So when they talk about domestic terrorism now, they're specifically focusing on white people, white Americans, as domestic terrorists. And now they're grouping all Trump supporters, particularly the white ones, which is like 90% of the Republican base, let's be honest. They're grouping them all in as domestic terrorists, which, as I'll explain further in the show, which can work to our favor as well. But if we look at this Daily Beast article, they're now comparing us, and it's not just Daily Beast, it's a bunch of different mainstream outlets. They're now comparing us to Al-Qaeda. They're comparing us to ISIS. They're comparing the attack on the Capitol to 9/11. So we're going to read a little bit through this article. It says, what we had here was a failure to communicate. Again, on January 6th, years after numerous investigations and study commissions picked apart the intelligence failures leading up to the September 11th, 2001 terror attacks. So there's the first comparison. Last week, America's security agencies were again caught flat-footed when another kind of militant, this time pro-Trump fanatics, stormed and trashed the citadel of American democracy, nearly executing what Al-Qaeda had failed to do, destroy the U.S. Capitol. So two comparisons in there. Al-Qaeda and 9/11 terror attacks. This is who they're comparing Trump supporters to, and specifically white Trump supporters. I want to make that very clear to people. It's specifically the white people that they're targeting. And I've talked about this before, where we have white conservatives versus black conservatives. Whenever they get into trouble together, it's always the black conservatives who are let off more easily. We can look at the fight that occurred between Antifa and some Proud Boys, I think it was out in New York City a couple of years ago, where the white Proud Boys are serving years in prison while the non-white Proud Boy didn't serve years in prison. We can look at Enrique Tarrio. He turned himself in. He took responsibility for the burning of the Black Lives Matter banner in Washington, D.C. at the last Million MAGA March because the white Proud Boys, he's not a white Proud Boy, but the white Proud Boys were not able to be identified by authorities, and so therefore he took responsibility for that because he knew, and this was very courageous on his part, but he knew if they were to convict and charge the white Proud Boys for burning that Black Lives Matter banner, they would charge them with a hate crime, and they would serve years and years and years in prison. He took responsibility for this. He got arrested briefly the moment that he arrived in Washington, D.C. for January 6th, and then he was let go. And so when we talk about domestic terrorism and we talk about right-wing domestic terrorism, make no mistake, they're not talking about black right-wing people. They're not talking about Hispanic or dark Hispanic right-wing people. They're talking about white right-wing people. They're specifically targeting white people because it is that population that the system fears. It is that population that the system fears because it is that population that not only votes 90% for the Republican Party, but also it is that population that votes overwhelmingly in favor of gun rights and overwhelmingly in favor of free speech rights, and overwhelmingly in favor of the things that they hate and in favor of the things that they fear. And so when they talk about domestic terrorism, like they say here in the headline of this article, it's white domestic terrorism. White people, no one else. We have this other article from Los Angeles Times says white supremacist extremists are the nation's deadliest terror threat. And this came out on January 16th, 2021. This has been all over the news for quite some time, but it wasn't until the election, the recent election of 2020, that they actually have the power to do something about this now, but they've been talking about this forever. Far-right groups are behind most U.S. terror attacks, report finds. Now, you have this one here. Delayed Homeland Security report warns of lethal white supremacy. There's that term again, white terrorism, white supremacy, white terror. Obviously, we know this is not true. We just published this article up on the redelephants.com, and this article says the data show white terrorism is a myth, not backed in any statistical reality whatsoever. So you guys can check that out. I posted that up on my Telegram channel, but they don't care about the truth. They don't care about the truth. Our job now is just to really show some of the people that are maybe normies, as we say, apolitical, as we say, that maybe are not completely convinced by this, mainstream media narrative surrounding the Capitol siege. Our job is to show them with statistics, with facts, what the truth is surrounding that. But I really want to touch on this because the bills that they're proposing are very worrisome. I'm going to read this here. It says, the rising tide of domestic terror across the country, particularly from violent far-right extremists and white supremacist organizations, demand a response from Congress. It's not enough to just condemn hate. We need to equip law enforcement, meaning we need to weaponize law enforcement, federal enforcement agencies, and the police with the tools needed to identify threats and prevent violent acts of domestic terrorism. The Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act provides coordination between our federal agencies and makes sure that they are focused on the most serious domestic threats. And the most serious domestic threats, of course, are white people, and white conservatives specifically. I thank Chairman Nadler and Chairman Bass for their leadership on this issue and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for supporting this legislation in markup. I look forward to building support for the vote by the full House as soon as possible. So, of course, we'll keep an eye on that. But I really want to make it clear. To people who they're considering domestic terrorists. Basically all Trump supporters. We have the screenshot here from the New York Times, and they talk about the different groups that were at the Capitol building. Trump supporters. They say alongside the violent, the overtly racist, and the paranoid were thousands of devoted Trump supporters, some of whom even brought young children. The crowd was filled with people in MAGA regalia, and Trump flags were everywhere.